The dining room air smelled like cinnamon and manipulation. My mother pushed a plate of warm rolls toward me while her hands danced through the air. She described the Caribbean sun with a theatrical glow. Mom said they couldn't afford another ticket, so my sister went on the cruise. When they came home, the house was empty and every item I paid for was gone. They lost it. For now, they just smiled at their coffee. Lydia refused to look at me, her eyes fixed on the cruise brochure. The silence tasted like ash. My father finally looked up from his mug. He spoke about his health and the need for dignity after a hard year. He claimed the deluxe suite only fit 3 people. It was a budget necessity. Mother squeezed my hand with practiced guilt. She called me the family rock. I knew the truth sitting on the kitchen counter. They had financed this trip on a credit card with 18% interest. They were buying luxury what they did not have. I felt my internal machinery shift. I did not scream or flip the table. Instead, I nodded and smiled through the lie. They needed me to hold down the fort. I promised to water the fussy ferns and collect the mail. My mother's face flooded with relief. She called me a good daughter. I watched them pack their expensive swimsuits into suitcases I had purchased last Christmas. Every movement they made felt like a withdrawal from a bank account that was finally empty. The crew was quitting. I was already calculating the logistics. Saturday morning arrived with a frantic energy. I stood on the porch and watched the car pull away. My mother waved until they turned the corner. The neighborhood grew quiet. I walked back inside and locked the door. The house felt like a ledger of unpaid debts. I looked at the sofa and the television. I saw the washer and the dining table. These were not memories. They were $15,000 of my labor. I opened my laptop and started the spreadsheet. The manual override was engaged. I moved with the cold efficiency of a warehouse manager. The movers arrived on Tuesday at dawn. We worked in a rhythmic silence. They wrapped my gray sectional in thick plastic. The dining chairs were stacked like cordwood. I tagged every item I had bought with a small yellow sticker. We stripped the walls bare. I left my father's old brown recliner in the exact center of the room. It looked pathetic and small in the void. I handed the key to the foreman. My extraction was complete. 6 weeks later, the promotion felt like a fresh start. My new apartment overlooked the harbor. I made coffee in a machine I actually owned. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. She wanted to know where the microwave was. I did not reply. I sat on my couch and watched the waves. Lydia would have to find her own way now. The smear campaign they launched immediately upon return had failed against my binder of receipts. I was no longer a daughter. I was finally a person. I was free. The harbor lights shimmered against my new floor-to-ceiling windows. My executive suite felt sterile but safe. I sat on my gray sectional and gripped a cold bottle of water. The silence was a luxury I had earned through logistics and grit. My phone vibrated on the granite counter. It was a notification from the family tracking app. They were docking in Miami. My pulse spiked as I watched the little blue dot move toward the shore. They were coming back. I opened my laptop to review the digital ledger one last time. My finger traced the line for the $1,500 washer and dryer. Every transaction was a brick in the wall I had built. I had spent 8 years subsidizing their comfort while they treated me like a ghost. Now the ghost was gone. My manager, Mark, had sent a final confirmation of my promotion. The raise was life-changing. I was finally moving forward. Then a second notification appeared. My mother called 4 times in 3 minutes. I did not answer. The voicemail transcription appeared on the screen like a threat. She sounded frantic. She was asking why the front door was unlocked and why the house was so quiet. She had not reached the living room yet. I stared at the clock. It was nearly 10. The neighbor's dog started barking in my memory. I knew exactly when they walked through the door. The real storm was hitting. The next message was a frantic photo from Lydia. It showed the empty living room. My father's old brown recliner sat alone in the center of the void. It looked like a museum exhibit of their own neglect. I felt a sharp pang of triumph followed by a cold shiver. They knew exactly where I was because I had forgotten to disable the GPS, a mistake that turned my sanctuary into a trap. The blue dot on their screen pointed straight to my new home. I had left a trail. The pounding on my door started an hour later. It was aggressive and rhythmic. Through the peephole, I saw my mother's face twisted in a mask of fury. My father stood behind her, leaning heavily on his cane for dramatic effect. Lydia was pacing the hallway. They looked like strangers. I took a deep breath and turned the lock. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of travel and resentment. They burst into my space. "What have you done?" my mother shrieked. She looked at my furniture arranged in the new room. She saw her sofa and her television. She saw the dining table where we had eaten those manipulation rolls. My father pointed a trembling finger at the TV. He called me a thief in a voice that shook with real rage. I did not flinch. I reached for the binder on the counter. I held the receipts like a shield. They were trapped. I opened the binder to the first page. I pointed to the Best Buy receipt from 3 years ago. It had my signature and my account number. My mother's eyes darted toward the exit. She realized the smear campaign would not work here. I told them the bank was closed. I told them to leave before I called the police for trespassing. Lydia finally stopped pacing and looked at the floor. My father dropped his cane. The game was over. The heavy binder hit the granite counter with a dull thud. My father stared at the Home Depot logo on the first receipt. His face transitioned from crimson to a sickly, pale gray. My mother tried to snatch the folder, but I pulled it back. I told them this was my property. I had the paper trail for every single item they missed. Lydia remained by the door. She looked smaller without the cruise ship lights behind her. She knew. "You are being cruel," my mother whispered. She gripped the back of my sofa. It was the same sectional I had bought for her living room last year. I pointed to the signature on the delivery slip. I reminded her that I paid $1,200 for her comfort, while she planned my exclusion. She claimed they needed the cruise for my father's heart. I countered with the credit card interest rates I had found. The air grew thin. The power shifted when I pulled out the secondary ledger. It tracked 8 years of utility bills and grocery runs. I had spent over $100,000 on their survival. My father leaned against the wall. He looked at the floor as if searching for an escape. I asked if they wanted to go to court. I had the dates, the amounts, and the bank statements. My mother's theatrical poise shattered. She began to cry. Lydia finally spoke up. She asked where they were supposed to sleep tonight. I suggested the floor of their empty house. I told them the brown recliner was still there. It was the only thing I had not paid for. My sister looked at me with genuine shock. She had never seen me without my rock persona. I was no longer the safety net. I was the person they had pushed too far. They were truly alone. My mother tried one last manipulation. She mentioned the neighbors and the local church group. She threatened to tell everyone that I had robbed them. I smiled and tapped my iPad screen. I told her the receipts were already uploaded to the family group chat. I had emailed the truth to Aunt Carol an hour ago. The smear campaign was over before it started. The silence in the room was absolute. They had no cards left. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet and sharp. I did not need to shout to be heard. My father picked up his cane. He did not look at me as he turned toward the door. My mother followed him. Her shoulders were hunched. She looked like the aging woman she was. Lydia stayed for a second longer. She reached out, but I stepped back. I was done with their touch. They left. I locked the door and leaned against it. My heart was a steady drum in my chest. I looked at my furniture in my new home. Belonged here. I sat on the sofa and opened my banking app. I saw the first paycheck from my new promotion. It was a clean slate. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my parents' front door. It was wide open. I stared at the screen until the pixels burned. The photo showed the front door of my parents' house, standing wide open. Moonlight spilled onto the porch, highlighting the empty space where my life used to be. My heart hammered against my ribs. I did not recognize the sender's number. Was it a neighbor or a threat? I grabbed my jacket and keys. I had to know if they were okay. The peace was gone. The drive was a blur of orange streetlights. I pulled into the familiar driveway and killed the engine. The house looked skeletal without the glow of the television I had reclaimed. Silence draped over the property like a heavy shroud. I stepped onto the porch and pushed the door. It swung back with a low groan. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood. My father's recliner sat alone in the center. He was gone. I called out for my mother, but only an echo replied. The kitchen was a graveyard of shadows. I walked toward the back of the house, my boots clicking on the bare floorboards. In the master bedroom, the closet doors hung open. The extra suitcases they'd hidden were gone. They had not stayed to fight or mourn. They had simply vanished into the night. I felt a strange hollow victory. Then I heard a muffled sob from the hallway. It was Lydia. She was huddled in the corner of her empty bedroom. Her phone was clutched in her hand. She looked up with red, swollen eyes. She said they left her. They took the car and the remaining cash. They told her she was a reminder of their failure. I realized then that my parents were not just choosing a cruise. They were choosing to run away to the second house I'd unknowingly funded. My sister was their final casualty. I sat on the floor beside her. I did not offer a hug. I asked where they went. Lydia shook her head and showed me a text message. It was from our father. He told her to find Hinsley if she needed a roof. He was done being a parent. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had outsourced their guilt to me one last time. They expected me to fix their broken child. I refused. You have to leave, I said. My voice was like ice. Lydia stared at me in disbelief. She asked how I could be so heartless. I told her I was finally out of currency. I had no more understanding to give. I stood up and walked to the front door. I told her the house was going to be foreclosed soon. She needed a job and a plan. I was not her mother. I was a survivor. I walked out to my car without looking back. The unknown number texted me again as I started the engine. It was my mother. She said they were starting over in a new state. She told me to take care of Lydia because I was the strong one. I deleted the message and blocked the number. I drove toward my harbor view. As I pulled away, I saw a black sedan parked down the street. It followed. The black sedan trailed me through 3 quiet turns. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I adjusted the mirror to see the driver. It was a man in a dark suit. My heart raced as I reached the highway. I needed to get to my executive suite. The harbor was my only refuge now. I pushed the accelerator and watched the sedan keep pace. They were not hiding anymore. They were letting me know I was watched. I pulled into the parking garage and took the lift. My floor was silent. I entered my apartment and locked every bolt. I stood in the dark kitchen and looked at the harbor. The black sedan was idling near the entrance. This was not my parents. They did not have the discipline for a stakeout. I realized then that my father's credit card debt was deeper than interest rates. He had borrowed from the wrong people, using our future as collateral for that cruise. The phone rang on the counter. I did not recognize the number. I answered with a steady hand. A man's voice asked if I had enjoyed the furniture. He knew the sectional was Italian leather. He knew the cost of the television. My father had used my purchases as collateral for his hidden loans. He had sold my life before I even reclaimed it. The power in the room shifted. I was now a target for his debts. I told the man I had the receipts. I told him the property was legally mine. He laughed with a dry, rattling sound. He did not care about store warranties or bank statements. He wanted the $15,000 my father had promised. If I did not pay, he would visit Lydia next. My sister was still sitting in that empty house, vulnerable and alone. She was the only leverage they had left. I had to choose a side. I grabbed my binder and my laptop. I could not stay in the suite. I drove back to the family house under the cover of night. The sedan followed at a distance. Lydia was still on the floor when I arrived. I told her to get in the car. She asked why I was back. I told her we were leaving the state. I packed her into the passenger seat and ignored her questions. We were both ghosts now. We drove until the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I checked the mirror every 5 minutes. The sedan was gone. I pulled into a rest stop and looked at my sister. She looked exhausted and broken. I told her the truth about our father's loans. She did not cry this time. She just stared at the dashboard. We had been sacrificed by the same people. I felt a cold, sharp bond form between us. We were finally alone. I opened my banking app and looked at my savings. It was enough to disappear for a while. I had a new team and a new title. I could work from anywhere. I reached for the glove box and found a spare key taped to the back of the manual. It was for a storage unit my father had hidden years ago. I looked at the address on the tag. It was in a town I had never visited. My father had left one last secret for me to find. The storage unit. An address from the key I'd just found sat on the rusted edge of a forgotten industrial park. We arrived as the fog began to lift from the cracked asphalt. Lydia gripped the door handle with trembling fingers. She asked what we were looking for. I did not have an answer. I only had the brass key and the heavy weight of my father's final secret. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cold morning air. The silence was thick. I felt watched by the empty windows nearby. I slid the metal door upward with a violent screech. The unit was small and smelled of mothballs. Dust danced in the beam of my flashlight. At first, it looked like junk. There were old boxes and a stained mattress. Then I saw a heavy steel safe bolted to the floor. My father had never mentioned a safe. He was supposed to be broke. I knelt on the concrete and saw a keypad. It was a digital lock. He had used a complex security system. Lydia stood at the entrance as a lookout. She whispered that a car was idling at the gate. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried the obvious codes first. I used birthdays and anniversaries. Nothing worked. The keypad blinked red with every failure. I realized the secret was not hidden in a date. It was hidden in the ledger. I opened my binder to the logistics page for the cruise. I found the confirmation number. I punched the digits in. The lock clicked. The heavy door swung open to reveal the truth. There were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Instead, I found a pile of legal documents and 3 thick ledgers. These were not mine. They were the original deeds to the family house and several properties downtown. My father had not lost his wealth. He had hidden it to avoid taxes and his creditors. He had played the victim for a decade while I paid his bills. The betrayal felt like a physical weight. I flipped through the pages with frantic speed. I found a life insurance policy taken out in my name. The beneficiary was a shell company I did not recognize. My father had turned my existence into a financial instrument. He was not just a gambler. He was a predator who viewed his children as assets. Lydia walked over and looked into the safe. She saw the deeds and gasped. She realized her fragile status was just a role in his play. He used us. Suddenly, the black sedan pulled up to the unit. The man in the dark suit stepped out. He did not look like a debt collector anymore. He looked like an accountant for the underworld. He told me the safe belonged to his employer. He said my father had used the deeds as security for a very different kind of cruise. The luxury trip was a hand-off point. My father had traded his family's safety for a clean slate. The pressure in the park grew. I stood my ground and held the ledgers. I told the man that the property was legally tied to my name now. I pointed to the notarized signature and the power of attorney seal on the final page. My father had secretly signed over the power of attorney and property rights to me during his last health scare, intending to use me as a legal shield against his collectors. He had done it to protect the assets from the very men standing before me. I held the power of their entire operation. The man narrowed his eyes. He realized the responsible daughter was now his biggest problem. I was the boss. Lydia grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the corner. She stood beside me with a look of pure defiance. She was done playing the victim. I told the man to call his boss. I offered a trade. I would return the deeds if they guaranteed our safety and wiped the debt. He hesitated. I showed him the laptop. I told him the files were already set to auto upload to the federal authorities. It was a bluff, but it worked. He reached for his phone. The conversation was short and sharp. The man nodded and stepped back into his car. He told me they would be in touch to finalize the transfer. They drove away, leaving us in the settling dust. I felt the adrenaline begin to fade into a cold, hard resolve. We were safe for now, but the world had changed. I looked at the brass key in my palm. It felt like a weapon. My father's secret had become my leverage. We had to move fast. We packed the ledgers into the trunk and locked the unit. Lydia asked where we would go next. I told her we were going back to the harbor. I had a team to manage and a house to sell. I was going to liquidate every asset my father had hidden. I would take the money and build a life that no one could touch. As we drove away, I saw my father's recliner in my mind. It was empty. I was the one who finally won the game. The tires hummed a low funeral dirge against the cold pavement. Lydia leaned her forehead against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass. She asked if we were actually going back to the harbor. I told her the harbor was just the start. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The deeds in the trunk felt like a ticking bomb. We were carrying my father's lies in a cardboard box. I had to liquidate everything before he resurfaced to claim it. We reached the executive suite as the city lights began to flicker. I parked in the shadows and scanned the perimeter. No black sedan waited this time. We moved quickly through the lobby, holding the ledgers close to our chests. Inside the apartment, the gray sectional looked like a relic from a past life. I opened my laptop and began searching for the shell company. I needed to know who actually owned my life insurance. The search results were a maze of dead ends. Lydia sat at the granite counter and started making a list. She was documenting every memory of my father's business trips. She realized now that his health scares always happened when a loan was due. He used his heart to stop the questions. I found a hidden folder in the digital files. It was a scanned copy of a second mortgage. He had borrowed against the house to pay for Lydia's college, but she had never seen a penny of it. He stole it. I felt a surge of cold fury. He had used my sister's future to fund his own escape. I told Lydia the truth about the mortgage. She did not scream. She just picked up a heavy glass and threw it against the wall. The sound of shattering shards was a relief. We were no longer victims. We were the reckoning. I drafted a formal demand letter to the shell company. I used the corporate letterhead from Davidson Logistics. I was moving with professional precision. The doorbell rang at midnight. My heart stopped. I checked the peephole and saw a courier in a blue uniform. He held a thick envelope. I opened the door and signed the electronic pad. The envelope contained a set of keys and a single map. There was no note. I recognized the keys. They were for the house I had just gutted. The map showed a specific location in the basement. My father was communicating in code. He wanted me to return home. I showed the map to Lydia. She said it was a trap. I agreed, but I could not leave the house to the banks yet. We drove back through the silent streets. The empty house looked like a ghost ship. We entered through the back door and headed for the cellar. The air was damp and smelled of copper. I moved the old workbench as the map instructed. Beneath the floorboard sat a locked wooden box. I used the brass key. It fit perfectly. Inside the box was a collection of high-definition photographs. They showed my mother and father in a different city. They were sitting on a balcony with drinks in their hands. They looked happy. They looked young. But the date on the photo was from yesterday. They had never intended to start over. They had just moved to their second home. The one I had unwittingly paid for through my rent payments. They were not running from debt. They were running from me. I realized then that the black sedan belonged to them. The man in the suit was not a collector. He was a private security guard. They were watching me to ensure I did not find the deeds. My father's secret was not a debt. It was an exit strategy. He wanted me to stay in the harbor while he lived in the sun. I looked at the photos and felt the final cord snap. I was done being a daughter. I was a creditor. Lydia picked up one of the photos and tore it in half. She asked what we were going to do with the deeds. I told her we were going to sell them to the men my father feared most. We would take the payout and leave the state for real this time. We would leave no trail and no forward address. I pulled out my phone and dialed the unknown number. The man in the suit answered. I told him I had a new offer. The man agreed to meet at dawn. I hung up and looked at my sister. We were standing in a house that was no longer ours. It was just wood and nails. I took a match and lit the demand letter. I dropped it onto the pile of photos. We watched the images of our parents burn. The fire was small but bright in the dark basement. We walked out and did not lock the door. The game was finally over for everyone involved. The cold morning mist clung to the windshield like a wet shroud. I gripped the thick manila envelope containing the deeds, while Lydia watched the entrance. We waited at the edge of the abandoned shipyard. The black sedan appeared from the fog and stopped 10 feet away. The man in the suit stepped out. He did not smile this time. I felt the weight of 8 years of lies pressing against my chest. This was a final transaction. My parents were already gone. I stepped out of the car and held the envelope high. The man reached into his jacket. My heart stopped, but he only pulled out a heavy tablet. He showed me a live video feed. My parents were sitting on their sun-drenched balcony, sipping cocktails. They looked happy until a shadow fell over them. 2 men in uniform stood behind their chairs. I realized the black sedan was not their protection. It was their containment. My parents were the actual debt. The stakes changed. The man asked me for the deeds in exchange for their freedom. I looked at the screen and saw my mother's terrified eyes. She reached for the camera, but a hand pushed her back. I felt no urge to save her. I looked at the paperwork in my hand. These properties were the only real thing left of my family. I told the man that the deeds stayed with me. I was the new owner. I had already filed the transfer. They froze. You would let them rot? The man asked. His voice was a low rasp. I told him they had already let me rot for a decade. I offered a different trade. He could keep the parents and the hidden debt. I would keep the assets and the silence. Lydia stepped out of the car and stood beside me. She looked at the tablet and nodded once. We were done paying for their luxury. The man narrowed his eyes. He saw the cold logic. The man took the tablet and turned it off. He told me the debt was settled through the forfeiture of the parents. They were no longer my problem or his employer's concern. They were simply gone from our lives. He stepped back into his car and disappeared into the gray mist. I stood on the asphalt and felt the final cord snap. The air felt lighter. The world was suddenly huge. We were finally the only ones left. I felt a chill. I walked back to the car and looked at my sister. I told her it was over. We drove toward the highway and did not look back. I opened my banking app and saw a new deposit. It was the first payment from the property rentals. I was no longer the rock or the doormat. I was the architect of my own life. Lydia reached for the radio and found a song. We drove into the light. I had finally won.